Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic today is the Harlem Renaissance, from Harlem to Nashville. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the Harlem Renaissance, Dr. RMitchell. Dr. Mitchell is a professor at Fisk University as well as the chairman of the Department of History at Fisk University. And of course, Dr. Mitchell, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Haney. It's always a pleasure to be here.
And Dr. Mitchell, you know, it's always a pleasure to have you here. And you know the number of shows that we've had an opportunity to collaborate on,
yes.
whatever,
yes.
And you always give us what we consider to be excellent information that we've been able to take back into other situations, classrooms, lectures, and et cetera, and we certainly appreciate that, appreciate you for that.
Well, much of that is because you're an excellent interviewer, Dr.
Well,
Haney.
I appreciate that. Dr. Mitchell, before we get started today, let's have you to give our audience some information for those rare individuals who might not know of Dr. RMitchell. Let's have you to give them some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important in terms of leading you to a professor at Fisk University as well as the chairperson of the Department of History at that great institution. Okay. Let's do it from that point, and then we'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance.
Thank you, Dr. Haney. I'm a native Nashvilleian. I'm a product of education in Nashville. I attended Nashville's Catholic and public schools. I graduated from historic Pearl High School. A lot of friends, and we're doing lots of things with the unions at Pearl. I did my undergraduate work at Fisk, right up the street from Pearl. And early on, I noticed there was a certain energy about education and activity in life here in Nashville. I've always enjoyed it. I met you, I guess, when I was working on my master's degree at Tennessee State a few years ago. I did the doctorate at Middle Tennessee State and postdoctoral studies at Harvard. So hopefully Nashville has provided me with an education where I can now serve in the classrooms at Fisk. I taught at several other institutions, but I think that the challenge remains the same, and it remains important, providing a basis for an education. My youngest son, when I was leaving the house and told him that you and I had been known each other for years, he said, well, both of you are classroom teachers. I said, that's right, we're school teachers. He said, well, Dr. Haney is famous, but he's a school teacher.
That's a more honorable profession than a teacher.
So,
yes, it is.
So you understand how
yes,
it is. I've enjoyed 20 years now at Fisk, my alma mater. It wasn't my first teaching job. I taught at Middle Tennessee State and taught at several other institutions, but I've enjoyed Fisk. The challenge remains the same, and certainly our discussion this morning of the Harlem Renaissance, it's sort of natural being at Fisk, being around the Harlem Renaissance, to look at the study and look at the Renaissance as really a part of daily life and teaching activity.
You know, I think we entitled this segment, well, this show entirely, as the Harlem Renaissance, from Harlem to Nashville. And I'm sure, Dr. Mitchell, that there are some who might wonder about the Nashville connection with the Harlem Renaissance.
Well, we'll explore it fully, but certainly Fisk and Tennessee State are repositories, because those luminaries who were a part of the Harlem Renaissance, the writers, the artists, the thinkers, many of them would become professors at Fisk and at Tennessee State. And the influence of what they were doing, their work, would certainly become a part of the guiding curriculum and the sort of institutional image of both of these institutions in Nashville, the Athens of the South.
You know, let's look at the Harlem Renaissance, because I think that when we think about Harlem, we think of certainly a large metropolitan area in New York, and at the same time, the influence that it had not only in Harlem, but outside of Harlem and as far south, in a real sense, perhaps even further, as you might reveal to us today, even to reach down deep into the South. What about this Harlem Renaissance? What is this all about?
The Renaissance was a response to America. It was African Americans, Negroes, colored people, finally responding to America. It was responding to the art and culture of America. What the Renaissance said is that America was a prolific place, that it inspired people, even its sons and daughters from America who had arrived here in chains and enslaved. You're exactly right, because the influence of the Renaissance reaches into the Caribbean. Eventually, the Harlem Renaissance becomes a worldwide intellectual movement, which springs from Harlem. It springs from the American experience. Many writers and thinkers say that the Renaissance and what it did in music and art and literature is one of, if not the only, truly American experience. So it's Americans of African ancestry using America to create a new cultural influence, a movement. It's identity, it's pride, it's poets, but it's an American movement.
If you had to select a general date or a general idea that would sort of bring into focus all of this activity that would one day be described as the Harlem Renaissance, what would be that great activity?
Well, it would be post-World War I. Young African-American men, many of them college students, have participated proudly in World War I. They had fought in Woodrow Wilson's war to make the world safe for democracy. When they get home, they discover that they are still subjugated to the same rules that had afflicted Americans of African ancestry since the end of slavery, racism. So instead of asking for acceptance from the external, from the white community, they said, we're going to look internally. We're going to create. We're going to write. We're going to share our experiences. And this blooms eventually into the Renaissance of Harlem.
And so the Harlem Renaissance came as a result out of some of the activities and some of the feelings, some of the ideas that had perhaps been generated by the First World War.
First World War, and actually it goes back to the very beginnings of American slavery. When I'm subjugated to inferior status, when I can be enslaved, it says that I'm some way different, if not inferior. You can't enslave an equal. You don't continually enslave someone that's equal. So a whole new system had to be developed, new ideas regarding race to allow me to be subjugated. Even with the Civil War, and of course, the fight for freedom was not the initial cause of the Great American Civil War, but freedom for African Americans was the great outcome of that war. With the end of the war, you have the beginnings of racism. Not beginnings, but you have the continuation of it. It's not a Southern phenomenon. We think of it initially as a Southern phenomenon, but now, as African Americans move throughout the country, as the great migration continues, they're subjugated to status, to being subjugated because of race. After World War I, these young men, these intellectuals, they explode. They begin to write and paint and produce. That becomes the Renaissance.
And that was the focus of the Renaissance. And so in a real sense, it's a cultural movement as well as an historical movement because of the chronology of it makes it history.
Well, in a while, we'll talk about a project that I'm very fond of. They're called Two Paths to Progress. It's all of those paths which lead me to self-identity. Great influence was also, and we'll discuss, I hope, the Crisis and the Opportunity magazines. These two outlets will allow African Americans to express themselves in literature, in art, in culture.
Let's look at those two magazines because I think that in a real sense you're talking about two organizations.
That's right.
I think more than anything the population is probably more familiar with these organizations. Let's talk about the Crisis magazine and the organization.
Well, the Crisis magazine was the information organ of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP.
Say something about that.
Every organization needs a way to contact its people. The main focus of the NAACP initially was to combat the problems that African Americans suffered, especially hate crimes and lynching. It was to keep people informed. When the national media wasn't carrying stories pertinent to the struggles of African Americans post-World War I, the Crisis magazine, it carried those stories, but it also decided to include literature and expression. When black writers couldn't get published in Harper's Weekly, when black writers couldn't have their works reviewed in the New York Times, suddenly there's a Crisis magazine. Opportunity becomes the same organ, a way of communication for the Urban League. So these two pieces of media pieces, especially the Opportunity and Crisis, both in New York initially, and eventually the Opportunity will move to Chicago with the Urban League. But the young writers and thinkers, they come to have their works published. A young writer, if you're a writer, you want to see your word in print. And the ideas that these writers are expressing become the same ideas that most of the aspiring new black intellectuals are expressing. A feeling of frustration with America. These experiences become important.
And of course, all of these things will come together. And it will take on the generic name of what? The Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance, the rebirth. A birth of culture, a rebirth of culture. You know, prior to this, Americans of African ancestry were colored. They weren't black, they weren't Negro. Suddenly there becomes this new.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Mitchell, let us take this first commercial break, after which we'll come back and we'll continue this conversation on the Harlem Renaissance. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.